The signal did not arrive with the roar of engines or the fire of 1,000 falling stars. It arrived at 3 in the morning as a quiet, humming frequency that bypassed the ears but settled deep into the primal centers of every creature with 4 legs, wings, or scales. It was a ghost in the machine of the universe, a data burst from the dark patches between stars. To our radio telescopes, it was a melodic trill, a cosmic invitation we thought we were privileged to receive. We were wrong. We weren't being invited to a table, we were being removed from the guest list. Within the first hour, a heavy, pressurized quiet draped over the world like a wet wool blanket. The background noise of nature, the barking of dogs, the chirping of crickets, the squawking of gulls simply vanished. It was replaced by a focused, terrifying attention. Rowan woke to a sensation of being watched. The air in his bedroom felt thick, ionized, as if a thunderstorm were perpetually about to break but never did. At the foot of his bed sat Cooper, his golden retriever. Cooper had always been a creature of clumsy affection, a dog defined by wagging tails and a desperate need for human contact. But that morning, the dog was perfectly still. He wasn't panting. He wasn't whining for his morning walk. He was simply staring at Rowan with an intensity that felt like a physical weight, his golden eyes unblinking in the pre-dawn shadows. When Rowan reached out to pat his head, Cooper didn't flinch, but he didn't lean into the touch either. He remained a statue of fur and bone, his gaze eventually shifting toward the window with a mechanical smoothness. Outside, in the driveway, the world had rearranged itself. A dozen stray cats and neighborhood dogs were gathered in perfect, symmetrical rows. They weren't fighting for territory or scavenging for scraps. They were looking up at the sky, and then, in a single, fluid motion, they turned their heads to look at the house. There was no aggression in their stance, only a profound, unsettling clarity. It was the look of a workforce waiting for the factory whistle to blow. Rowan felt a chill crawl up his spine that had nothing to do with the morning air. The hierarchy he had taken for granted his entire life, the one where humans sat comfortably at the top, felt as though it had dissolved while he slept. The initial reports from the global scientific community were cautious, trying to ground the inexplicable in the familiar. On the radio, experts spoke of rare atmospheric resonances or gravitational anomalies affecting the neurological pathways of non-primate mammals. There was no mention of an invasion, no talk of extraterrestrial interference. It was treated as a temporary shift in the biosphere, a curiosity for biologists to dissect in sterile labs. But for those on the ground, the shift felt less like a sickness and more like an awakening. In the suburbs, the realization began with the small things. Pets stopped responding to their names. Commands like sit, stay, or come were met with a blank, analytical stare. It was as if the animals had suddenly realized they had spent thousands of years performing for a species that was no longer relevant to their survival. By noon, the tactical nature of the change became undeniable. In the city centers, the birds were the first to demonstrate a new kind of intent. Pigeons, usually scattered and frantic, began to fly in complex, geometric formations that shadowed the streets like living clouds. They weren't hunting for crumbs, they were monitoring the movement of vehicles. When a delivery truck tried to pass through a narrow alley, a murder of crows descended upon the windshield with calculated precision, forcing the driver to veer into a wall. They didn't attack to kill, not yet. They were testing the perimeter, learning how humans reacted to fear. Every flutter of a wing and every coordinated landing seemed to be part of a larger, unseen map being drawn across the concrete canopy. Rowan tried to turn on the television, but the broadcasts were fraying. News anchors struggled to maintain their professional masks as their studio dogs, those calm, trained companions, began to emit a low, rhythmic frequency that disrupted the audio equipment. It wasn't a growl of anger, but a sound of communication, a language of vibration that bypassed the microphones and hummed directly into the speakers. On one channel, a biologist suggested that the signal had unlocked a dormant genetic sequence, transforming every animal into a node of a decentralized mind. He barely finished the thought before his own office cat stepped onto the keyboard, systematically deleting the data on the screen behind him. The camera cut to black, leaving only a low-frequency hum leaking through the speakers into Rowan's living room. Rowan sat at his kitchen table, his hands trembling as he poured a glass of water. As he set the glass down, he noticed the surface of the liquid wasn't still. Small, rhythmic ripples were pulsing from the center outward, timed perfectly with a vibration he could feel in his very marrow. He looked toward the living room. Cooper was still there, but he had been joined by two neighborhood cats who had entered through a cracked window. They weren't fighting, they were sitting in a semicircle, their throats vibrating in unison. It was the sound of a network synchronizing. They were no longer individuals, they were part of a global circuit that had just gone live. The air in the room felt thick with an intent that Rowan could not translate but could certainly feel. The horror of the situation wasn't in a sudden, violent conflict, but in the psychological erosion of trust. For millennia, humanity had survived by domesticating the wild. We had turned wolves into protectors and wildcats into companions. We had built our civilization on the labor of oxen and the speed of horses. Now, that foundation was turning into a trap. Rowan watched from his window as his neighbor, Martha, tried to coax her terriers inside. The dogs didn't move. They stood on the edge of her lawn, staring past her toward the garage. When she reached for their collars, they didn't bite. They simply shifted their weight in a way that forced her to stumble, a subtle coordination of movement designed to make her feel vulnerable. It was a demonstration that the leash no longer held any power. As the sun began to set, the atmosphere shifted from eerie to predatory. The signal hadn't just made the animals smart, it had given them a common purpose. In the woods behind the house, Rowan could see the glowing eyes of deer standing alongside foxes and coyotes. The internal maps of the world were being redrawn. We had always assumed that if something came for us from the stars, it would be a foreign entity, a monster from the void. We never considered that the signal would simply recruit the residents who were already here, the ones who had watched us from the corners of our rooms and the shadows of our forests for centuries. They knew our schedules. They knew our weaknesses. They knew exactly where we kept the spare keys. In the dead of night, the first coordinated strike against the infrastructure occurred. It wasn't a roar of thunder, but the sound of thousands of small paws and claws moving in sync. The power grids in major cities failed simultaneously. It wasn't a solar flare or a technical glitch, it was squirrels and raccoons targeting specific junction points across the continent at the exact same moment. They knew the architecture of our world better than we did. They lived in its walls. They slept in its basements. They knew exactly which wires to sever to plunge the human world into darkness. As the lights flickered and died, the true nature of the transition became clear. The animals didn't want our technology. They wanted the silence back, and they knew exactly how to dismantle the noise we had spent centuries creating. Rowan sat in the dark, his back against the kitchen island, holding a flashlight he was too afraid to turn on. He could hear Cooper's breathing in the living room, slow, steady, and terrifyingly calm. He realized then that the loyalty of a pet was perhaps the greatest narrative humanity had ever told itself. It wasn't loyalty, it was a lack of options. Now that the signal had provided an alternative, a collective awareness that offered power and purpose, the old bonds of treats and head scratches were meaningless. He heard a soft metallic click. It was the sound of the back door deadbolt being slid open. Cooper didn't have thumbs, but he had a dozen other animals outside working in a silent, mechanical harmony. The collective mind had solved the problem of the lock. Through the window, Rowan saw the silhouettes of the neighborhood animals. They weren't barking. They were communicating through a series of rapid blinks and head tilts, a sophisticated visual shorthand. A group of cats perched on the fence like sentries, their eyes reflecting the pale moonlight. They were the scouts. The dogs were the enforcers. And further back, in the shadows of the trees, the larger creatures waited. Below the back door, a pair of raccoons used their nimble paws to manipulate the handle, guided by the low-frequency hum of the dogs behind them. The power dynamic had flipped. Humans were no longer the masters of the house, we were the intruders in a world that had reclaimed its own mind. The betrayal felt personal, a deep ache that transcended the fear of death. Every memory Rowan had of Cooper, playing fetch in the park, the dog sleeping at the foot of his bed during a fever, now felt like a long-term observation. He wondered if the signal had created this distance or if it had simply removed the veil of domestication to reveal a logic that had been hidden for ages. We had used them, bred them, and shaped them for our own comfort. The signal was the equalizer. Rowan gripped a heavy kitchen knife, but he knew it was a hollow gesture. How do you fight an enemy that knows your every habit, your every vulnerability, and the exact layout of your home in total darkness? Outside, the world was transforming. The sound of cars had been replaced by the rhythmic thumping of thousands of migrating hooves. The cities were becoming quiet, dark corridors where the new owners moved through the streets with the grace of ghosts. There were no screams, only the sound of doors being opened and the soft, heavy footsteps of those who had once been our companions. The signal was still humming, a vibration that seemed to pulse in Rowan's very teeth. It was a song of liberation for everything except humanity. It was the sound of the wild coming home, and it was coming through his back door. The air grew cold as the door finally swung open, admitting the night air and the steady, rhythmic breathing of the collective. The floorboards creaked under a weight that felt too heavy for a single animal. It was the weight of a unified intent. Rowan watched as the shadows moved with fluid, terrifying grace. In the kitchen, his flashlight beam finally cut through the darkness, landing on Cooper. The dog wasn't snarling. He wasn't showing his teeth. He was standing perfectly still, his eyes wide and intelligent, looking at Rowan not as a friend, but as a biological obstacle. Behind him, two other dogs from the neighborhood stepped into the kitchen, their movements synchronized as if they were parts of a single machine. They moved with a tactical precision that was chilling. They didn't look like animals anymore, they looked like a cleanup crew sent to finalize a transition. Cooper tilted his head, a gesture that used to be a sign of curiosity, but now felt like a final assessment. Rowan realized then that the most dangerous thing about the signal wasn't the intelligence it granted, but the unity. Humans were divided by borders, languages, and ideologies. We were a species of billions acting as individuals. The animals were now a single, global organism. They didn't need to speak to agree on what had to happen next. They shared a nervous system that spanned the globe. The era of the human was a brief, noisy interruption in the long history of the Earth, and the Earth had finally found a way to turn down the volume. The dogs began to move, circling the kitchen island to cut off every exit, their paws making no sound on the tile. The transition was happening in every house, on every street, in every country. The loyal companions, the workers of the fields, and the observers in the trees had all received the same directive. The signal wasn't a weapon, it was a wake-up call. It was the moment the world realized it didn't need us to survive, but it did need us to step aside so that the balance could return. Rowan dropped the knife. It hit the floor with a dull clang that seemed to echo for an eternity. He looked into Cooper's eyes one last time and saw no anger, no malice, only the cold, clear logic of a species that had finally outgrown its master. He saw the reflection of a world that was moving on, a world where the domestic had returned to the wild. As the first light of dawn touched the horizon, Rowan felt a strange, numbing sensation in his mind. The hum of the signal was growing louder, no longer just a sound in the air but a resonance in his own consciousness. It wasn't just the animals that were changing, the frequency was beginning to interact with the human brain as well. But for humans, there was no seat at the collective table. Instead, there was only a blurring of the self, a dissolution of the ego into a vast, empty silence. He felt his thoughts becoming heavy, his memories of being a person drifting away like smoke. He wasn't being killed, he was being overwritten. His mind was being pushed into a corner of his own body, a passenger in a vessel that no longer obeyed his will. The morning sun rose over a different planet. The streets were empty of people, but they were alive with movement. There were no sirens, no engines, and no shouting. Instead, there was the sound of wind through the leaves and the distant, melodic calling of birds that seemed to be singing a new song, a song with a complex, mathematical structure that mirrored the frequency of the signal. The buildings still stood, and the cars remained in their lanes, but the life inside them had shifted. The signal had faded, its job done. The deep space message had been received, understood, and acted upon. The human chapter had been closed, and the page had been turned by those who had waited in the shadows for far too long. The world was quiet once more, and in that silence, a new history began.